Coffee's in. Thanks both, and we'll be back then as we hear more. Tonight, though, we bring you an extraordinarily rare voice here on Newsnight. One of the 8 serving members of America's Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, became just the second woman to be elected to the Supreme Court. At 83 years old, she's exploded into something of a pop icon amongst young liberals, blistering in her dissent, but always softly spoken. The US Supreme Court's possibly the single most influential body in deciding the direction of America's cultural and social laws, more politically potent even than the president. Tonight, Justice Ginsburg tells us of her fears for America now and the parallels she draws with America's past. To grasp anything of America's political system, you have to start by understanding the importance of the Supreme Court. This is where the most highly disputed issues, slavery, segregation, gun rights, freedom of speech, get debated. And this ostensibly neutral body is perhaps the most highly politicised in the land. The bench is usually made up of 9 justices, though there's currently 1 vacancy following the death last year of Antonin Scalia. 4 of those who sit are liberals, 4 are conservatives. They hold their positions for life. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was appointed by President Clinton in 1993. A passionate advocate of women's rights, she spent much of her early career with the American Civil Liberties Union.
Here to comment is liberal Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
In latter years, she's become something of a cultural phenomenon. Her character's portrayed in the hit TV satire Saturday Night Live.
Justice Ginsburg blasted Trump as a faker who really has an ego.
She shocked the establishment last year when she broke convention that justices do not comment on current political events by making clear her opposition to the then candidate Trump, later apologising for her remarks.
And I would just like to say that I hope you get some relief from my day.
She has a lifelong passion for opera, and it was at the final dress rehearsal of the opera Dead Man Walking at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., an opera looking at the moral ambiguity of the death penalty in America, that Newsnight's Ollie Lambert sat down with her for her first interview since Trump's victory. He began by asking her if she felt we were now living in a post-factual world.
I'm optimistic long run. I was a great man. Once said that the true symbol of the United States is not the bald eagle, it is the pendulum. And when the pendulum swings too far in one direction, it will go back. Some terrible things have happened in the United States, but one can only hope that we learn from those bad things. Think of when I grew up at the time of World War II. The irony was we were fighting a war against racism, and yet by an executive order of President Roosevelt, people who had done nothing wrong, except they were of Japanese ancestry, were interned in camps far from their homes. That was a dreadful mistake. It took a long time for the United States to realize how dreadful it was. But ultimately, the president acknowledged that there was no reason to intern people of Japanese ancestry, and Congress passed a bill providing compensation for the people who were interned or their survivors.
But do you see echoes in that kind of historical story in the present day?
Well, I would say that we are not experiencing the best of times. But there's hope in seeing how the public is reacting to it. The Women's March, I've never seen such a demonstration, both the numbers and the rapport of the people in that crowd. There was no violence. It was orderly. So, yes, we are not experiencing the best of times, but there's reason to hope that we will see a better day.
What is it about the current climate that most concerns you?
Our legislature, which is the first branch of government, is right now not functioning. But I can think back to 1993, the year that President Clinton nominated me for a vacancy on the Supreme Court. I had spent 10 years of my life litigating gender discrimination cases. I was one of 4 general counsel to the American Civil Liberties Union. And yet, the vote to confirm me was 96-3. No one raised a question about my affiliation with the American Civil Liberties Union. That kind of rapport doesn't exist now. But my dream is that we will get back to it one day. I think it will take strong people from both parties to say, let's get together and work for the good of the country.
I mean, you mentioned the legislature, but I'm thinking of you specifically as a judge at this point. There's been a lot of quite outspoken criticism of both individual judges and the judiciary as a whole, one being called a so-called judge. You know, as someone who served a lifetime in the courts, how do you feel about the new administration's quite public criticism?
I don't want to comment on that.
You're 83. You're the oldest serving member on the Supreme Court. How long do you think you can do this?
At my age, you have to take it year by year. I know I'm okay this year. But what will be next year? I'm hopeful, however, because my most senior colleague, the one who most recently retired, Justice John Paul Stevens, stepped down at age 90, so I have a way to go.
Since you were made a Supreme Court judge, how do you feel women's equality and women's rights have changed?
If you just look at the numbers, when I became a Supreme Court justice, there were 6 women in the Senate. Now there are 20. I was the second woman on the Supreme Court, and when Justice O'Connor left, I was all alone. Now I have 2 colleagues, Justice Sonia Sotomayor and Justice Helena Kagan. People ask me, well, when do you think there will be enough? I say, well, when there are 9. And people are aghast. We've had 9 men for most of the country's history, and no one thought that there was anything wrong with that.
I want to return to something that we talked about at the beginning, that's to do with the sort of erosion of facts and truth. It just feels like there's less and less that one can be sure of. And I wonder, both in sort of, not just in the news, but in all sorts of ways. I wonder if that's something that strikes you as you look around.
What is important is that we have a free press, which many countries don't have. Think of what the press has done in the United States. I live in the famous Watergate. That story might never have come out if we didn't have the free press that we do.
Why do you mention that? Do you feel it's something that's maybe forgotten?
I read the Washington Post and the New York Times every day, and I think that the reporters are trying to tell the public the way things are.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice, speaking there to Ollie Lambert.